Now that we've talked about what Milgram's experiment was like from the perspective of the participants, let's talk about what was really happening. A participant responds to an ad for a study of learning and memory, but in fact, it's a study of obedience to authority. This study took place right after the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi who was one of the major organizers of the Holocaust. He justified his actions in the Holocaust by saying that he was just following orders. There was a lot of discussion around the country about whether people like Eichmann were fundamentally evil or whether ordinary people would follow horrible orders from an authority figure. One of Milgram's goals in his experiment was to see if ordinary American men would follow orders that could result in pain or even danger to others. By the way, all the participants in the original experiment were men, but later experiments showed that the same results can be obtained with women. When two participants came to the lab, one was a real participant, and the other was actually working for the experimenter. We call this second person a confederate. This is someone who seems like just another research participant, but is actually fooling the real participants to help make the experiment seem real. Both the real participant and the confederate choose randomly from among two slips of paper to see which one will be the teacher and which one will be the learner. In fact, both slips of paper say teacher. The confederate doesn't show his slip to the real participant. He lies and says that his slip says learner. The teacher, who's the real participant, is shown the shock generator and gets a real but mild shock from it. However, most of the buttons on the shock generator are fake. It can't really produce strong shocks. The teacher then sees the learner being strapped into the electric chair. The door closes with the teacher and experimenter in one room and the learner, who's actually the confederate, in the other room. At this point, the confederate actually gets out of the electric chair, but the teacher, the real participant, can't see into the confederate's room and believes that the confederate is still strapped into the chair. The learning task starts, and the confederate makes button press responses on each trial according to a script. When the teacher presses buttons on the shock generator, it lights up and makes sounds as if it's delivering shocks to the learner, but it doesn't actually create any shocks. When the voltage eventually gets up to 300 volts, the confederate bangs on the wall as if he's trying to get the teacher to stop. And then he stops responding to the word pair learning task. If the teacher stops at some point and asks the experimenter if it's okay to continue with the shocks, the experimenter follows a carefully constructed series of 4 responses designed to prod the teacher to continue. If the teacher gets past all 4 of these prods and still wants to stop, the session ends, and the experimenter then explains to the teacher what the experiment was really about and reassures him that nobody was actually being shocked. The participant gets to meet the learner, who's actually confederate, who assures the participant that he's fine and didn't actually get any shocks. However, prior to this point, the participants are absolutely convinced that the experiment was real and that they were delivering powerful, dangerous shocks. Earlier, I asked you to write down the voltage at which you think you would refuse to continue, the voltage at which the average person would refuse to continue, and the percentage of people who would go all the way to 450 volts. So what did you write? Most people say that they would stop fairly early, and certainly no later than 300 volts when the learner pounds on the wall. Milgram surveyed a set of 40 psychiatrists, and they predicted that most participants would stop at 150 volts or earlier. So what did Milgram actually find? Well, Milgram tested 40 people, and he found that 26 of them never stopped. In other words, 65% of the participants made it all the way to 450 volts. And all 40 participants made it at least to 300 volts, the point where the learner banged on the wall. 9 of the participants stopped at that point or after one more shock. 5 more stopped between 330 and 375 volts, and the remaining 26 made it all the way to 450 volts. How did this fit with what you wrote down? Are you surprised that 65% of the participants never stopped? Most people are amazed that so many people would be willing to obey an authority figure to this extent, but this result has been replicated over and over and over again.